Chapter 61, Althea Village. Confirmed, Althea Village, LV1 has been constructed. Please check the status of your territory in the territory panel. Please set the entrance requirements and taxation standards. Changeable. Entry. Visitor pass, 1-day validity, 10 copper. Temporary residency, 1 month validity, 300 copper. Permanent residency, 10 gold. Taxation, 10%. Good guy, that bastard Bobby raised the prices by 10 times. Tusk. She, on the other hand, knew that the prosperity of a place was in the quantity and quality of its people, so she decided to lower some requirements. Confirm. Entry. Visitor pass, 1-day validity, 5 copper. Temporary residency, 100 copper. Permanent residency, 10 gold. Taxation, 10%. Yes, no. She set the entrance temporary residence fee to at least half the default. This would not only increase her population, but it would also allow the people to save more money to spend on more useful things. Things that, in the long run, would eventually strengthen themselves, and by extension, the territory. However, she retained the default 10 gold for permanent residency simply because she had the confidence in the territory that she would build. If the population became saturated, she might even increase this. Wise men said that the more difficult it was to obtain, the more it would be appreciated. She hoped that at least the permanent residents would be extremely loyal to the territory. The difficulty would also add prestige to the status. And with prestige, its intangible value would increase. Of course, she'd be adding alternative ways to earn this. This was something for later. Lastly, investing so much would also make people reluctant to leave. People's goal, even outsiders, would soon be to become permanent residents in her territory. She wanted the first thing people to think of when thinking of Althea was the good life it provided. Althea was planning on building a great territory, and she believed that her land would definitely live up to its name. It would be so proud that it would never be bullied, so powerful that it could protect all that it should, and so superb that it would lead the development and prosperity of those it sheltered. This was her goal. Sheila Smith hopes to join your village as a permanent resident. She directly clicked yes, and she looked at the men. Sheila had money because they took away valuables and safety deposit boxes in the hotel. What about the others? Harold and Eugene looked at her embarrassedly. Well, we could only afford the temporary residency for now. Althea chuckled. She wasn't planning on making them pay at all. However, in retrospect, they probably wouldn't feel very comfortable with taking advantage of her like that. In the end, she found a decent alternative for them. As the Lord's party, I can give you an exception and take the permanent residency as credit, she said, and the others brightened. A few pieces of gold appeared in her hand and handed to each one. The men brightened at this, while Maya just sparkled at the sparkly gold in her hand. We will definitely pay you back, Harold said, and Eugene nodded. Harold Lee hopes to join your village as a permanent resident. Maya Lee hopes to join your village as a permanent resident. Eugene Sparks hopes to join your village as a permanent resident. Eugene guided Theodore to do the same, which was a bit of a challenge. Theodore Pina hopes to join your village as a permanent resident. Althea smiled, seeing everyone now had permanent residency. Actually, I have a job for each one of you, but I'll study the territory first. She turned her head to Sheila. As the first permanent resident, I will give you a house when I finally create one. Thinking of the house she saw in royal territory, she frowned in distaste. Surely there were other options. Sheila almost hugged her and laughed. Actually, I hope to live with you, just waive my rental. This made Althea smile at her fondly. Sheila grinned happily, very different from her former timid self. Well, we'll prepare lunch while you study. Just tell us what you need us to do, boss. On their way here, in order to stop them from calling her Lord or Her Highness, she finally agreed with them calling her boss. It was cringy, but it was the best alternative they could think of. Althea nodded in dismissal, and she turned her head to look at the now-colored logo of a castle on her bottom left. Upon clicking the icon, 5 tabs would appear at the right side, namely, Territory, Buildings, People, Missions, and a grayed-out tab indicating Other Territories. She opened the first tab. Territory Stats. Name, Althea Village. Status, Village Level 1. Area, 3,142,000 square meters. Residents, 7. Total population, 7. Base resources. Wood, 5,500. Stone, 3,3000. Money, 9711 gold, 79,267 silver, 15,287 copper. Reputation, 0. Buildings, none. Building slots, 0.5. Hey, her money was the territory's money. She looked curiously at the base resource and mused how Bobby was trying to collect as much wood and stone as he could. Just how much did the buildings cost? Don't look at 1 unit of stone or wood. A single unit had a mass of about 1 cubic meter. Fortunately, a territory seemed to have its own space, with the limit being the stone and wood resources cap that she could see in the stats. Otherwise, she'd have to deal with where to place those massive cubes of resources. That aside, she quickly went to the next tab. She looked at the Residences tab and was grossly disappointed. While the commoner houses Bobby chose were in the lower tier, the higher ones still weren't worth it. The most expensive was the Lord's Castle at 1,500 wood, 800 stone, and 300 gold. No wonder the rest of the construction was so shabby. To be honest, she could not stomach consuming a building slot for any of these. She frowned, looking deeply at the panel. She would definitely not settle for anything uncomfortable. This would be their future home, after all. What was the use of a Lord token if the Lord couldn't do what she wanted? No, she refused to believe this was the only option. So she didn't choose a house in the end. Instead, she studied the panel deeply and thoroughly trying to find a good alternative. And indeed, she would find a very good alternative shortly after. It would still become one of the more innovative features of Althea to be known throughout the entire Xeno continent. Chapter 62, Choosing Buildings. Directly skipping the disappointing residential tab, she began to peruse the shop's tag. Looking at the holographic images, prices, and interface theme with earthy tones, Althea thought that this felt like e-commerce on a whole different level. The restaurant required 100 wood, 50 stone, and 50 gold to produce. The other similar shops like bakery, barbecue store, and the soup store required the same. She did not even consider these, however. After tasting the restaurant, she didn't believe the others were any better. Like the residential tab, this part would also be temporarily skipped. She went to the other parts of the building tab and saw the weapons store and armory. These required twice the resources and gold than that of restaurants. But she mused she would definitely take this for the automatic production of weapons and armors alone. Not to mention, upgrading the buildings would also allow more powerful equipment to be available. Without anyone who could consistently create weapons, these would be essential buildings added to her list of to build, possibly. Other buildings were grayed out, indicating her level was not high enough. The third tab was marked production. Only a 600 SQM farm was available for purchase. It increased the production of plants by 20%. Considering the fast refresh of the resources here, this 20% was immeasurable. It was just that, while there was no requirement on wood or stone, the gold requirement was huge at 10 gold per 600 square meter field. She could imagine how the other lords with only 1,000 gold would fare. Would they even purchase this, especially when there were so many resources outside? She doubted it. The fourth tab was administration. Here, only 2 buildings were available, but both made her eyes brighten. The first was the village center. With the village center, the Lord could post missions and recruitment. She could also buy supplies in the name of the territory. She could set the buying price and quantity, and people simply had to go there to sell their items for money. The Lord would also obtain the ability to send messages not only to all residents in real time, but also allied territories. It was just that the last function had a level requirement, but it wasn't like she had allied territories anyway. Of course, being extremely useful, the price was also very beautiful. It required 200 wood, 100 stone, and 300 gold. The other administrative building was the warehouse. The lowest level cost only 100 wood and 200 gold, but the size was 200 SQM with a 3-meter height. From the introduction, it seemed that she could also see the contents from her Lord panel next to the Resource Space tab. She could also take items as needed, as long as she was within the territory. It had a fresh keeping function which increased the shelf life by at least twice the time, and it would increase as the building was upgraded. Next one was infrastructure, though for now only dirt and simple stone pathwalks were provided. Fortunately, these were very inexpensive, so she didn't have to be stingy. These also didn't consume a building slot. Second to the last tab was defense, and she immediately went to the wall section. Here, she saw that a wooden fence 1 meter in height cost 0.1 wood and 5 silver per meter section. Very affordable. However, level 2 stone walls made a markedly huge price difference. 2-meter high stone walls cost 0.1 wood, 0.1 stone, and 10 silver per meter. If she chose to cover the entire territory, the cost would be sky high. The perimeter of her territory was nearly 6.3 kilometers. For a level 2 fence, the per meter cost would be over 600 wood and stone each, and over 600 gold. Level 3 was even more insane, with total costs of 1,000 wood and stone each, and over 1,500 gold. But, do you want to build a wall LV3 for 1,000 wood, 1,000 stone, 1,500 gold? The construction is permanent and cannot be moved, only demolished for a cost. Yes, no. Minus 1,000 wood, minus 1,000 stone, 1,500 gold. Althea looked at her wealth being eaten by a bulk with a conflicted expression. There was no other way. What happened to the royal territory really traumatized her. Although level 3 was expensive, its durability was 10 times that of the previous level, and hundreds of times better than the wooden fence. She had the money, so she directly placed the wall around the entire territory. In fact, if she had enough stone and wood, she'd have built the LV4 wall directly. One had to note that the existing walls couldn't be moved. Even if they were upgradable, the rectification cost would not be cheap, and it would still be more cost-effective to build a level 4 wall directly. It was just that the wood and stone requirements were huge and beyond her resource cap if she were to construct other buildings as well. She'd need to level up first before getting access to the level 4 wall. She watched as a long, elongated pit around the territory formed like magic, and from the bottom construction started. Althea could tell that the wall itself would also erect itself in a similar manner. Everyone ran to the area and marveled at the sight. So cool. This is amazing. How much does this cost? This is unscientific. Everything is unscientific. Oh, you're right. Althea chuckled at their antics and resumed studying the territory tab. Finally, she came to the last tab and had no text. It was an image of gears. She opened it, and as she read, her eyes became brighter and brighter. Before this, she had wondered if she had to build things on her own. But while not impossible, this wasn't practical. With the current situation, the manual methods she could only use were the older traditional construction methodologies. These often took months, or weeks at best. With the 4 of them, a good stone building could even take a year. She had not forgotten that the so-called protection period will end in a few weeks, at most. After all, she still wasn't certain how long a month was in this blasted place. But now that was not a problem. Because she could, apparently, customize buildings. Chapter 63, Custom Residence, Part 1. 28 Days of Protection Period. That lunch, Althea couldn't concentrate on eating because of everyone's heated gaze. She put down her utensils and stared them down. "Can we resume to normal, please? Also, I don't want people to know I'm the Lord here." "Understood, boss," Sheila yelled with a salute. "But I'm so curious. What does the Lord's control panel look like?" Althea sighed and gave them a rough idea, rousing a few oohs and ahs from time to time. "That sounds amazing," Harold said, and Maya bobbed her head cutely. "Does it look like a game panel?" Eugene couldn't help but ask. He was once a normal boy who had had his share of games, after all. "It's similar, but the theme looks medieval," Althea mumbled after a bit of thought. The technology was really futuristic, but the entire thing felt a bit old. It was very weird. A medieval game. Maybe. "But this is the real world, right?" Harold asked, and he couldn't help but remember some old science fiction movies he had watched when he was still a young lad. "Our consciousness didn't get taken and thrown to some game, right?" The girls rolled their eyes at this, while Eugene looked at him a little pale, seriously considering. The two then began on discussing some conspiracy theories, as well as what they could do. Ignoring the men's overactive imaginations, Sheila just turned back to the boss, asking more about the very interesting Lord panel. Sheila couldn't help but think of their accommodations tonight, and her face scrunched at the recollection of the houses in royal territory. "What about the residences?" she asked, a worried expression on her face. "They're not all like that, right?" If they had a choice, they would naturally want to live comfortably. They could be a bit choosy. Their boss was the Lord here, after all. Althea nodded at this and gently put down her spoon. "This is what I actually want to talk about," she said, turning to Eugene, who was discussing something about quests to find the mastermind with Harold. "Eugene." Yes. All the residential options aren't ideal, so I plan on customizing myself. Although we could only customize one, for now, I think it's worth using this slot on this." Being pregnant was uncomfortable enough. She really didn't want to wrong herself, not when she clearly had the power to avoid it. The 300 square meter limit for the custom house was more than enough. As long as the building was used as a permanent residence, it could be used to do whatever they wanted. She handed her portable tablet to Eugene. "Can you by some chance design a water supply and waste system for a self-sustaining house? Here's the folder of past knowledge about this issue." Eugene gaped at the tablet, scrolling and scrolling, and his eyes turned brighter and brighter the more he saw. Eugene's eyes absolutely sparkled at the plethora of information in his hand, not expecting the boss to save up detailed knowledge. "Can I copy?" he asked, lifting his head up with a bright face, very unlike his somber disposition a few days prior. He then shyly revealed his own tablet from space, amusing everyone. Good guy, he also had his own tablet, but then he realized the battery was gone and his shoulders slumped in disappointment. They inexplicably found this a little cute. "I have a charger here," Althea chuckled and released the smaller solar charger. "And yes, you may copy whatever data that you need." "Thanks, boss," Eugene said, immediately transferring the data he wanted. Afterwards, Althea and Eugene took advantage of the light and made a digital blueprint using their tablets, using the built-in programs to assist them in their calculations, drawings, and the like. The others, on the other hand, after finding out the importance of wood and stone, ventured to areas within the territory to gather the resources. Over half a day later, the designing duo whipped out a satisfactory modular model that could be used in more than one way. However, before they checked, they were pulled by Sheila somewhere to stand in front of small hills of both wood and stone. They apparently gathered resources as a contribution to the team. Althea smiled and naturally gave them the compliments they deserved. Her smile made their day. Althea stood in front of the hills and raised her hand, using willpower to try to place the items in the inventory. Would you like to place 16 units of wood and 7 units of stone in the territory space? Yes, no. She gladly took it and turned her head to the others. How long do you think a level 1 person would take to gather 1 unit of wood and 1 unit of stone? She asked them, thinking of the buying price she'd be setting. I would take about half a day to gather 5 units of each, Sheila said. Low-level people will probably be able to do about 3 to 5 units of wood a day or 2 to 3 of stone. She nodded, taking note. How much did Bobby buy it for? Housekeeper Harold reported this time. If I remember correctly, 1 unit of stone is bought for 10 copper, and wood is 5. This seems okay, Althea said, mentally setting up the buying price for resources. Even if the buying was the same with Bobby's. The cost of living was poles apart. Bobby charged a huge amount for that trashy food. She would not. It was unforgivable. In the royal territory, 10 copper coins wouldn't get you anywhere. In Altera, on the other hand, 10 copper coins could get you a lot of things. Her goal was to provide people with their basic needs, as long as they were not lazy and were willing to do fair work for fair rewards. Even if they just gathered resources for most of the day, she hoped they would be able to afford decent meals and have a roof over their heads. In her vision, everyone had the basics at the bare minimum. It was only when people had the basics could they have the consciousness to truly want to contribute to the whole, to contribute to the territory. Their territory, not just hers. Chapter 64, Custom Residence, Part 2. After settling the resources, the group soon gathered around to see the draft of the house to study it. The maximum built area allowed by the system for a level 1 custom building was 300 square meters. It had no other limitations on the floor area. She and Eugene had initially considered doing 3 floors with 100 SQM each floor, but later decided against it when they found their systems, and the available materials could only fight so much gravity. They had to recalculate a lot of things, because they found out the gravity was nearly twice that of Terran. Their bodies were just strengthened, combined with the stressful situation from the get-go, that they didn't feel the difference. In the end, they opted for a house module of 2 stories, with each floor about 120 SQM in size. It had 2 bedrooms per floor, a living room, a kitchen, and a bathroom. For single detached houses, each house had its own septic tank that processed the waste to fertilize the front and backyards by the newly studied waste stabilization techniques from Terran. The sitting toilet was made of carved stone, which was a bit uncomfortable for those who grew up with porcelain toilets, but it was enough for now. They didn't even have the most basic ceramics. How could they have porcelain? The pipes were fine because they could choose system materials, which wasn't a huge collection, and they could find a decent waterproof stone alternative. Speaking of, the pipes were all internal within the property. For now, people would still have to get their water from the river or the spring. She simply didn't have the capability to create the utility infrastructure as of yet. Each floor would also have its own water tanks, with pipes to the kitchen and bathroom. The wastewater from the sink will also be maximized. After combing through her notes, she had found a plant with similar properties to corn cob, which can be used to purify gray water. In this way, no water would be wasted at all, very sustainable, and she was quite proud of that. They also made the early low-tech versions of a biogas digester for gas. The cooking gas it could produce was limited, but it would be enough for a small team to use every day. Further, the stones they found were less porous and could be used in this relatively simple construction. They didn't want that thing to smell after all. There were also double walls, high ceilings, and other techniques like provisions for heated floorings and good ventilation. This was in case of extreme weather changes, whichever direction it was. They added insulation sheets under the roofs, made from local materials, of course. During the half-day drawing of the blueprint, Althea also tested a lot of the plants she hoarded on the way. One of which was hemp, and other plants they could obtain straw from. There were also metamorphic rocks they found that would be a good fire retardant, so they didn't have to worry about the insulating materials catching fire. It was similar to asbestos, except the carcinogens were non-existent. Even if there were carcinogens, she doubted it would cause damage due to their improved physiques. The final floor to use the remaining 60 square meters was the basement or cellar, about 2 meters in depth. As for how the residents sharing the house would divide its use, it would be up to them. Sadly, they couldn't give electricity for now, mostly because of the unavailability of the raw materials. However, electricity was something she added among the top of her must-figure-out list. For now, they used a lamp made of alternative materials to contain a torch or a lamplights. But the most attractive feature of custom buildings was that, after finalization of the main structure and functions, the shell itself was highly changeable on a per-building basis, for a cost, of course. For instance, if they decided to build duplex houses, they could. If they wanted to combine 2 units seamlessly into one, they also could. If they wanted to combine 2 rooms, they could, and so on. Basically, as long as the main structures were untouched, one could pretty much customize, or course, for a few silvers. She planned on eventually making themed communities to add color to her territory. They took another look at their creation in admiration. It was so good, considering the resources that they had anyway. Unfortunately, its cost was insane, and a part of her wondered if it was worth it. Most people probably wouldn't choose to activate the custom building option because the one-time cost of a blueprint implementation alone was a whopping 500 gold coin, at the minimum. In her case, she checked, and the cost was over 1,000 gold coins. However, the cost per building should still be fair. Generally, the residential buildings, except for luxury houses like the Lord's Castle, were much more affordable than other functional buildings. A small, standard bungalow house in the market was about 150 silver. The 2-story houses were about 300 silver or so. She didn't know yet the final cost of her custom house, as she hadn't confirmed the production yet, and she was a little worried. She looked at the fascinated people beside her, looking at the design, probably wondering what it was like to use it. What about you guys? If you were to design your home, what would you change? They were surprisingly vocal about this. A bigger kitchen with an island counter would be good. I would have a big anteroom. The living room is a bit private for me, Sheila said. A slide, Maya helpfully added. Theodore also nodded in agreement. The suggestions lasted for several minutes afterwards. This got Althea thinking, what if she provided a custom design service? There would be an exclusive community for these people, and she could reap even more profit. Of course, the first step was to actually get people to the territory. After all, she really placed her territory in the middle of nowhere. And she was very far from where majority of the population landed. Chapter 65, The Birdie Family, Part 1. Bright Territory. Ansel and Tom stood nearby the gates of the territory, right next to the dirt road, to see the new batch of refugees as closely as possible. They watched each new person enter the territory with sharp but concerned eyes. They scanned each new face, hopping to see familiar faces. They were not alone, in fact, as there were about a dozen others trying to see if there were people they knew among the crowd. The air was heavy with anticipation. One by one, they watched as the weary refugees emerged from the gates and to their sights. As it was in the previous batches, they saw more and more unfamiliar faces. Each had tattered clothes, bloodied bodies, and tired eyes. Without exemption, their statues exuded physical and emotional exhaustion. As the different strange faces passed by, both their moods turned more and more dour, until finally the last person entered and they only felt disappointment. Once again, unfortunately, there was no Althea. In Tom's case, there were no traces of his brother or his family either. The past few days they settled here, there had been more than 10 batches of survivors that entered. They saw that this batch was worse than the one before, and it was expected that the succeeding batches would be even more miserable. Tom sighed in melancholy. It's only been 4 days since we arrived in this world, but when I recall those peaceful times, it feels like a lifetime ago. Because it was a lifetime ago, Ansel just said with a frown, before sighing and went on to approach the dazed newcomers with a family photo he kept in his wallet in his hand. "Excuse me," he asked the person nearest to him, rousing the attention of all the others. Some stared at him guardedly, while a few girls inappropriately ogled. However, without exception, except for some amazement at the appearances on the photos, none of them had seen Althea or Garen. Still no luck. Tom found that he had to ask again, just to be sure. Ansel shook his head. At this, he and Tom finally headed back to their rented houses, hearts filled with disappointment. On their way, he looked around the territory. Because of the savings of the free wall, the lord of this territory had enough funds to build a lot of houses and facilities. So far, the hundreds of people already here had a dwelling, although a bit expensive for those who only had a few silver on hand. However, the lord here set up a guard team that could accompany citizens to go out, for a price, of course. While it was a bit expensive, the citizens could not only grow, but also gather some materials to sell. As long as the citizen was not lazy and had some capability, the trade was not a loss. Speaking of, he heard that the territory was preparing for an upgrade and needed more residents. With more residents, the military might had to be increased. As such, just this morning, the management of the territory made a notice through the village center. Those who passed the interviews for guard positions would have temporary residency taken care of for 3 months. This was a very good offer, and both the police officers and their party had gone to apply to the guard team. Speaking of the guard team, Ansel's eyes couldn't help but look around and fix on these so-called guards. Many of these guards were cronies of the lord here, patrol around their small territory. Most of them were connected after migration, but there were also a few people who knew the lord back in Terran. These people all had a menacing aura about them, completely incompatible with the gentle image the lord had been letting on. And they also had guns, a lot of them. Ansel, although young, had an eye for people, especially after entering the business. That Mitchell birdie definitely wasn't as gentle as he looked. However, he felt that the guy was still a bit sincere about providing a safe haven for their people, so Ansel would not judge him too much. That afternoon, they lined up in the restaurant to eat. Privately, they called it the Pig Food Factory. As they queued, he noticed that a lot of people around him flinched and stood in a daze, looking in the air in front of them. At the same time, the air changed. Because he was standing still, it wasn't so obvious, but there was definitely some movement on the ground. It was like a magnitude 2 earthquake that lasted a second just happened. However, it was really subtle, so he didn't place much attention to it. Instead, he looked at the others, including Tom, curiously. Ansel knew there was an announcement, visible only to the residents. The territory upgraded to level 2, Tom said with a smile, a bit hopeful for the future. The dry food they were now enduring seemed particularly decent for that one meal. After eating, the duo exited, planning on passing by the gate again in case new refugees come. However, on their way there, they noticed that there was a little gathering in the 100 SQM public square in front of the restaurant. After squeezing into the crowd, they realized it was the lord and 2 guards making an announcement. As you have seen, the territory has been upgraded. He paused, his harmless face plastered with a reassuring smile. The upgrade conditions have been met. 100 residents, permanent or temporary, and a population of 300 for 3 days. This is a good thing, but I don't know if it will have any effect outside. So I hope you don't go out for the time being. I will also announce it through the village center and call people back before we upgrade. The use of "we" was really inclusive. This guy had a pretty good EQ. Speaking of which, he had been here for a few days, but he had never exchanged a word with this guy after the entrance, wherein he made an obvious invitation for him to join his guard team. Ansel didn't show anything at the time, but he was recruited with such certainty, as if he was sure he'd somehow be of help to him. At the time, Ansel couldn't help but think, Could this guy see his stats? Because of this, Ansel naturally rejected him because he didn't have much of a good impression of this plasterface. Still tactful, the Lord didn't contact him again. But, seeing as he had no progress with finding his sister even after so many days, it looked like he'd have no choice but to interact with him again. Sigh. How unfortunate. Chapter 66, The Birdie Family, Part 2. After so many days without a clue of Althea, Ansel had unfortunately come to a conclusion that it was time to thicken his face and ask this guy for information. Anyway, the more annoying, pompous, fatty/spokesperson wasn't here to bloviate on the Lord's greatness. No one would be mocking him for asking for help. Ansel patiently waited for Mitchell to finish his speech before coming to find him. Ansel stood at the path of his exit, trying not to appear as pompous as he usually did. "How may I help you?" Mitchell asked, as friendly as always, while his cronies didn't look at him very well. This was understandable. He rejected their lord after all. Ansel took out the family photo on his wallet. "I'm looking for my family, especially my siblings." Mitchell nodded and gracefully took the photo. The man's blue eyes stayed on the picture for a moment longer than others. "Your sister is very beautiful," he finally said after a pause, "and your brother looks very powerful." He tacitly didn't ask about the others and just assumed everyone else had passed. Ansel was taken aback by the comment. "You could tell." Ahem. Then, the enigmatic man looked at his cronies and showed the photo, and they shook their heads in response. "Sadly, none of us here are familiar with either of them," he said. "May I know their names? Lords could see the names of anyone in the territory." Ansel was surprised that he was so generous in telling him this, and his impression of this guy increased a step. In the end, though, after Ansel told of their names, Mitchell still shook his head apologetically. Ansel sighed, shoulders slumped. "Well, thank you anyway." At the very least, now that he was certain Althea wasn't here, nor had she had any intersection with anyone in this place, there was no point in staying. He needed to go somewhere else. Ideally, another territory. He voiced it out as soon as they got back to the dwelling after eating. The others looked at him in surprise. "Are you really leaving?" Tom looked at Ansel, who was really ready to go. "Now. Isn't it good to just wait for news here?" Artie asked with a puzzled frown. Ansel shook his head. "She's in her 3rd trimester. No matter how capable, she is in a weakened state. What if she's waiting to be saved somewhere?" The team were surprised to find the state of his sister, and they even mused about the chances a pregnant woman had in surviving. The odds weren't very good, but they didn't voice it out. "I can only ask you to make her stay if you encounter her here. If I don't find her in the next territory, or even get a clue, I will come back to see." Tom and the others looked at each other, wondering how they'd make him stay. However, even if they had only been together a few days, the experiences they had together made for deeper bonds than a lot of friendships back in Terran. So, they knew there was no talking things out with him. Tom sighed and they patted his shoulder to express his blessings. "Be careful, stay alive." The other two did the same, expressing their well wishes. Little Lily even went to give him a sweet hug. "I will come to you when I grow up. You must marry me." Except for her father, whose worried expression turned to a murderous one, everyone else laughed at her cuteness. Ansel also said his goodbye and stood up, with the team following to see him off. However, as they headed to the gate, he saw another batch of refugees lining up. They couldn't help but take a look together, hoping for some luck. Anyway, regardless of whether there were familiar people, the state of the new arrivals were as they had guessed. The new batch was indeed much more miserable than the previous one. Not only covered with blood, but there was no piece of clothing undamaged. He even saw someone who lost an arm. Ansel, feeling that he was stared at, turned his head to look at the crowd. His eyes met with a woman's, well, 2 of them to be exact. He didn't think she was familiar, but he saw strong recognition in the other person's eyes. He frowned, and after thinking, he stepped forward, wanting to go and ask about Althea. He saw the two women flinch a little and straighten their backs, and eyes looking at him in anticipation. One was blatant in her stare, while the other one was reserved, but both were equally disgusting. He was not talking about their current state of blood and mud, but it was more of a problem of temperament, of the soul. Although he's had a lot of women, he was still choosy. They had to be beautiful, strong, and of good character. Like Althea, of course. He pushed the bile back down and continued his approach. Who knew? Maybe they would really know where Althea was. However, not even a few steps were taken when a piercing yell came soon after, distracting him from the thought. "Are you an NNN?" A piercing yell screamed, hitting everyone's ears as well as their hearts. BSDS. Character interaction. Ansel, hi there, angels and dudes. It is I, Ansel Witt, and I've been tasked to spearhead this new corner AuthorSan decided to add. After all, you are all so awesome and we want to hear more from you. I know the timing's off, but we don't want to get too serious, right? This is a light-hearted story, damn it, written and read for relaxation only. Oh, and you can ask me anything spoiler-free, Tilda. For example, what's my favorite food? What time do I wake up in the morning? What's my favorite brand of toothpaste? What about you? What are you liking about the story so far? Nah, never mind. You don't have to answer that. I know it's me. Chapter 67, Run. Aberdeen City, 16 years ago. Little Ansel heaved out a deep breath as they finally got out of the small tunnel. It took him a while to get his bearings, and was only brought back when he felt something warm and equally dirty on his gunk-covered hand. It was a little hand, covered with black-green stuff that looked so mushy and disgusting. Still, he did not pull back his hand. In fact, if he hadn't been so scared before, he'd also realized that the hand she covered his mouth with was this very hand. Little Althea, nicknamed Little Monkey, didn't seem to notice her handprint on the other boy's face. She just pulled the boy and gestured for them to go. "Let's go," she told him, her little voice a bit milkier due to all the whispering. Ansel looked at her small hand on his and nodded blankly. "So, kid, where do you live?" she asked as they moved, looking down on him from time to time. 9-year-old girls were generally more than a bit bigger than boys a year younger than they were. The two of them were no exception. Little Ansel also had a timid personality and didn't eat a lot, so it was not surprising when the boy couldn't answer her question and only stared at her. The little girl mused that she had never heard him speak after hanging out with him for so long. Couldn't he talk? Like that cleaning auntie from the orphanage. But before she could ask, they heard heavy footsteps not far behind them. "There!" the man yelled, sprinting. Even if they ran as fast as they could, their little feet were no match for the massive, long legs of a grown man. The man gestured to grab them, but one more dose of adrenaline allowed them to avoid the grasp. However, there were uneven rocks on the ground, and they lost their balance anyway. "You dare escape!" the man yelled and gestured to kick the little boy, but the little girl quickly grabbed his feet. "Watch out, kid!" she yelled, grabbing the fat leg with her whole body. Ansel saw everything, and the quiet boy finally spoke up. "You. Run, I can handle it," she said, flexibly letting go of the leg before getting kicked, avoiding the other man's hand and getting a few stones on her hand. The timid boy could only do as he was told and ran past the trees and the bushes, sobbing, not knowing what to do. 28 days of protection period. Bright territory. Roser. Hundreds of wild beasts approached the gates and the walls with massive force. However, before the group of beasts could touch the wall, hundreds of wooden swords and arrows met them head-on. They were standing on the wall, with just enough room for them, practicing their balance as well. A few minutes earlier, they had received notice to ask all citizens to help to deal with the beast tide. In exchange, for every 100 monsters they dealt with, they would be receiving a certain amount of silver. Ansel looked around as he killed a beast. No one seemed to be counting. How were they so sure about the number of kills? Like seeing their stats, Could lords have other omniscient capabilities in their territories? Tusk, how annoying. He vented his annoyance on the monsters, quickly getting in the zone, and his rate of hitting critical shots skyrocketed. Use Stab E, Mana. Use Stab E, Mana. Use Stab E, Mana. Killed, Nomos LV1, plus 30 copper, plus 30 experience. Killed, Nomos LV1, plus 30 copper, plus 30 experience. Killed, Hui Mouse LV1, plus 30 copper, plus 30 experience. Killed, Nomos LV1, plus 30 copper, plus 30 experience. Use Stab E, Mana. Use Stab E, Mana. Killed, Nomos LV2, plus 50 copper, plus 50 experience. The strongest mobs were at level 2, but fortunately the humans made up for it in number. Not to mention, the Lord himself was at level 3, so they could manage. Speaking of, that Mitchell was really capable of wielding his sword. As long as the monster was level 1, he was sure to kill it in 1 or 2 attacks. However, there seemed to be no end in sight, and eventually people started falling. More and more people got injured or died, and the morale was slowly dwindling. Midway, the Lord's group bravely went deeper into the fight and killed as many as they could. Fortunately for them, the Lord was also a good marksman, and he saved a lot of lives with his shots, earning him plenty of grateful stares. With the Lord and his cronies leading the way, newfound courage increased the morale of the whole territory. Anyway, if they didn't fight now, the territory would fall, and they'd die anyway. Ansel nodded in approval of his actions. He could at least acknowledge that the Lord here wasn't so useless. He threw away the sword with only 1 durability left and took out another. He also jumped down the wall, joining in the bloody fun. Tom and Artie joined them down, but Bruce understandably did not. He had a daughter to care for after all. He would naturally choose to kill from the safety of the wall, not risking anything for the sake of his Lily. As they slashed through the mobs, gaining hundreds of copper and experience, they somehow found themselves near the Lord's party. Mitchell and Ansel, at some point, even fought back to back. "We work quite well together," Mitchell said, slashing on a monster's eye. Ansel didn't answer and jumped up, using his skills to push away the snap of the monster's teeth, and immediately making a sharp parry. "Your brother taught you well, it seemed," the other man said. But it was so subtle, combined with the cacophony of the chaos around them, Ansel wasn't sure what he heard. This momentary distraction almost got him eaten, though, so he forgot all about this. Ansel immediately focused on the scores of enemies trying to eat a body part of his. As he fought desperately, he could feel himself getting more and more skilled, and he was energized. No matter what, he ought to be strong enough to protect Althea when he found her. He wouldn't be running away ever again. Chapter 68, Found You. Aberdeen City, 16 years ago. The young Ansel rushed past the shrubs and trees, ignoring the cuts he was suffering along the way. However, he accidentally stepped on overgrown roots and tripped. "Ouch," he mumbled, little tears forming in his eyes. His feet hurt, his arm hurt, and his leg was bleeding. He tried to drag himself, but he couldn't go even a few centimeters. Little Ansel couldn't help but sob. He was so useless, he couldn't even walk. And what about that girl? She was only an inch bigger than he was, and she was a girl. Shame enveloped his young body, and yet he couldn't do anything about it. He could only cry like he always had, sniffing, rubbing his snot with his dirty hands, making his face even dirtier and more pitiful. Then he heard rustles from the bushes, and his fear was exacerbated. He stopped breathing and covered his mouth with his small hands to be sure, closing his eyes in fear. As if he couldn't see, he couldn't be seen either. But after the rustles, there was a pause, and Ansel mustered his courage to squint his eyes open, just a little bit to see. He saw those brilliant emerald eyes again, staring straight at him, bright as always. Even if there were drops of blood dripping in her eyelashes, it was still so beautiful. Seeing him all in one piece, a happy smile graced her pretty face. "Found you," 28 days of protection period. After a few hours, the mob had finally lightened up, eventually running away. Seeing the scene, many people cheered, but most of them just lost their footing from tiredness, still couldn't get back up from exhaustion. In the midst of this, Ansel was approached by a certain lord, that same smile plastered on his face. "You did a good job," he told her. "It's a pity you're unwilling to be my right-hand man." Michiel, who, despite the blood on his shirt, stood straight and unaffected. Unlike everyone else, who were all gasping for breath. The tone creeped Ansel out and unconsciously gave him a bad stare, eyes looking around for the pompous sidekick he had. "Where's the other one?" The man's face darkened a little. "If you're talking about Pho, I never said he was my right-hand man." Then he smiled again. "You can certainly be." No, thank you." The people around saw the Lord's favor on him and looked at him heatedly, some in annoyance while some in greed. Ansel reckoned that someone would definitely try attaching to him after seeing the importance the Lord placed on him. Tusk, annoying. To his surprise, someone actually approached him almost as soon as things calmed down. It was the two girls, looking very dirty with their ripped attires, but still as well-kept as they could be, all things considered. The first girl approached him with a confident attitude that reminded him of an annoying peacock, except that peacocks were male and were actually endearing. This one just irked him, like the cringy sound metal made when rubbed against another metal. There was also another girl a step behind her, meek and graceful, a bit better kept, making a contrast with the other girl. But he didn't like either of them. He belatedly remembered them as the two women who had recognized him earlier, and Ansel decided to patiently wait for what they had to say. "Ansel," Peacock Girl said with a nod. It was also with such certainty as if she was sure Ansel would recognize her. Instead, Ansel crossed his arms and gave her a look over. "Who are you?" Her poised stature cracked as she looked offended and aghast at his ignorance. "We've been neighbors for years." He looked blank, but he disliked noisy, self-absorbed shrews the most. "I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with aunties." There was a burst of laughter in the crowd, and the girl's face looked as red as a baboon's butt. In humiliation, tears lined up her eyes as she glared at him. "You are just like your sister." Ansel's pompous look changed immediately. "You've seen her," he said a statement, walking over and grabbing her shoulder. He shook it, sexy eyes filled with anticipation. "Where?" Ramona looked very reluctant to speak, while blushing at his warm touch. Next to her, Sandra looked at Ansel obsessively, remembering his gallant fight and the succeeding appreciation of the Lord here. She had seen him before in Terran, albeit from afar, along with that husband of Althea's. That orphan was surrounded by excellent men since she was a child. What about her? She had to betray her body for scumbags. She took a step forward at this time. "We don't know where she is now. We were separated days ago." A part of her wanted to throw some shade, but she had heard about this guy's "my sister is always right" attitude and didn't want to take any risks. Ansel's eyebrows furrowed as he tried placing the new girl, letting go of his hold of Ramona, to the latter's annoyance. Fortunately for Sandra, she had several physical features that were quite similar to Nanny that he eventually recognized her. "Ah, you're Nanny's daughter," he said, and the girl brightened at being recognized. Then she recalled Althea's reaction, and she paled, immediately letting tears run, breaking her surviving suitors' hearts. "My mother, she said she had passed away." She paused. "Althea told me she killed her herself." Ansel's heart dropped, and his throat felt like it was blocked by something. Nanny. And Althea, she had to kill Nanny with her own hands. How sad was she? He closed his eyes to push down the depression. It was not the time to mourn, not yet. When he opened his eyes, he had regained some clarity. After a beat, he looked at Sandra. As someone who had been with at least a few dozen women, and even more suitors, how could he not know of Sandra's crocodile tears? But Ansel's poison didn't spread to her simply because she had news of his sister. What direction did she come from? Sandra genuinely wondered whether to tell him. She didn't want Althea's life to be even easier than it already was, but Ansel saw her reluctance and added, "I'll owe you a favor." "Deal." But Sandra maintained her meekness and did not show the brightness in her eyes. "They were heading to the mountains in the east," she said softly. "She was with another woman, an old man, a little girl, and a dog." "Thanks," he said, nodding politely. He even took out a can of dried fruit he saved up. "Here." And after politely bidding farewell to his acquaintances, he ran out the gate, quickly disappearing from view. Although he had been a bit tired from the fight, this news energized him so much that he felt he could run for a few more hours. "Althea, I finally found you." Chapter 69, Start of Construction. Althea Village. Althea stared at the holographic map of her territory and made a rough plan of what to build. To be honest, she was really looking forward to this. Before anything, though, she needed to budget. Although she was rich, if she splurged, it wouldn't stay that way. Territory building was a money-burning endeavor. If she didn't make sure she was on positive at the end of the day, the minus could compound, leaving her poor. She absolutely didn't want to be poor. As such, she had to do some urban planning first. She opened the holographic map with cute earthly tones and stared at it for a while, making plans in her head and also on her tablet. The entire territory was about 3 square kilometers, or over 300 hectares in size, with the mountainous areas of the Half Valley already occupying around 40 hectares. She was not planning on wasting these areas, of course, and she did have a preliminary plan on what to do with these difficult terrains. But for now, she would be focusing on relatively flat lands and the areas near the river. The section of the 50-meter-wide river in the territory was located on the southeast part of the village, forming a chord of almost 2 kilometers in that length. The head of the valley was more or less in the northwest side of the territory. Interestingly, at the spot where the curvatures met, there was a small stream that would eventually end to the river. This area was quite critical. Rivers and streams were connected in a naturally occurring system called a watershed. While watersheds were good for the world, if not handled well, it could also mean a bit of trouble for the territory. For instance, when rain came, it could cause problems like flooding or water surges. So she designated the areas prone to flooding into public parks. It would be even better if she found some mangroves or similar vegetation, but this was an issue for later. As she observed her surroundings further, a familiar ding ran inside her head. Construction of LV3 walls completed. Gates and sentry towers now available for purchase. Construction is considered part of the walls and will not consume a building slot. Her pretty eyebrows rose in interest. Level 3 walls could apparently have a sentry attachment available, which was extremely pleasing news. The best part was that it would not consume a slot. She immediately went to study the new construction. Sentry towers. Available with level 3 walls and above. Capable of automatically attacking hostile forces 100 meters away. Rate, 1 shot per 3 seconds. Consumption, 0.001 wood per shot. Cost, 20 wood, 10 stone, 5 gold. She nodded and mused that, although expensive, these things would probably be worth it. She looked at the walls and studied it a bit more, first deciding to locate the gates. In her zoning plan, she had designated the eastern and southwest parts of the territories as high-traffic areas. Althea placed the gates in these directions, primarily in locations where foot traffic would likely go. For example, relatively flatter lands. The gates themselves were relatively cheap as long as the wall was already there, so it wasn't too painful to buy. -100 wood, -100 stone, gold. -100 wood, -100 stone, gold. It was the sentry towers that made a pinch in her wallet. Placing sentry towers every few hundred meters, she ended up building quite a few. -20 wood, -10 stone, -5 gold. 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 2 gates and 63 sentry towers were built, just like that. The density of sentry towers could be said to be overkill, but it was the only way she'd feel comfortable. Anyway, those towers would automatically shoot arrows at all hostile forces within its range. Althea thought that 1 tower was worth a dozen troops. Just like this, her wood stock was nearly halved. It was very painful. However, it was still enough to build the necessary buildings and a small community. It was just that she would definitely be lacking resources until they found more people to gather them. Hey, she could imagine how people would react, how high their expectations would get as they go inside the strong wall, only to see a few buildings. However, because of this premium, this would also give her the capital to charge exuberantly, which she wouldn't do. Probably. It would depend on the situation. After pondering, she decided on the other 4 buildings: custom house, village center, weaponry shop, and a farm. The house was obvious. She could even make the lower floor open plan for a custom multi-purpose building with commercial functions. Of course, the building type limitation would limit the 2nd floor to a residential space, no exceptions, but this was already a great alternative to what was available in the system. She'd cover the main roads with these. Not too much for now, she was lacking in resources. As for the cost of building her custom 2-story house, she thought it was fair at 500 silver per unit. However, by virtue of assisting the poor and milking the rich, she set its selling price at 50 gold coins, but rented it out for only 100 copper per floor a day. To encourage a longer stay, the rent was further reduced to a more cost-effective 20 silver, or 2,000 copper, per month. Based on the choices in the system, she could estimate the length of a month to be around 32 days here, so it was a very good deal for both parties. As for houses with open spaces, each house would get 50 SQM yards. In these small lots, they could do whatever they wanted, particularly if they had bought the space. They could plant their own small garden, make a small gym, a playground, or a leisure spot. It was all quite flexible. For a duplex setup, where each floor would be owned by different parties, she divided the front and backyard equally with 25 SQM yards each. Satisfied with her classifications, she moved on to the next concerns. After the residential and commercial spaces were the public amenities, the most important of which, to her, was the village center. If nothing else, the communications function alone was worth the price. When she reached a certain level, she could even communicate with allied territories, whenever it may be. Weaponry shop was also self-evident. However, the armory shops could come later, because for now she thought farm would be more appropriate. The very expensive wall would provide them with defense, and the people inside, and the sentries, could shower the enemy with arrows. The farm, on the other hand, was necessary for protracted battles. She had no idea how often or how strong beast waves were, but she had to make sure the stable source of food for the territory. Even if the resources of this world refreshed quickly, if the population was big, it would not be enough. Not to mention, the variety was sorely lacking. She convinced herself of this and made a preliminary plan. For now, she only had enough money to develop one side. However, since she could not move these buildings after their erection, she still had to place them carefully. So she decided to develop the southwest gate first, the direction they came from. She rubbed her hands together, bright emerald eyes staring at the various structures she'd be building, feeling very elated and extremely excited. Finally, she'd finally be building their new home. Advertisement. I will be mass releasing, around 15 chapters on September. It'll be on a privileged tier, though. I have also drafted around 150 chapters now, and I am in need of a refresher story lol. A refresher story is a story that will help my brain keep fresh and proofread better than if I'm just stuck on a single story. Here are my WIPs that have a remote possibility of being published this year. 1 Interstellar Rebirth, Back to the Apocalypse. Blurb, a princess from the interstellar times fails to escape from misfortune, inadvertently perishing in a black hole. Her soul is then pulled back to the end of the 21st century, which marked one of the greatest changes for all of humanity, the apocalypse. We'll have 3 volumes, Childhood Arc, Pre-Apocalypse, and Apocalypse. 2. Woke up in the interstellar, got amnesia, married, and then turned my planet into a game map. Blurb, a female magician had to stay in hibernation to keep her life. Little did she know, she'd wake up 20,000 years later. Oh, and her home planet's about to get destroyed. We'll have 2 arcs, Interstellar and Planet Building. I'm considering heavier and earlier romances in both of them. I do want your opinion on this, since I know this story has a lot of dude readers. Also, would you mind legitimate love triangles? Not like on this one, where the ML and FL are absolutely single-minded and pretty much no drama on the romantic side. So there, which one would you more likely to check out when it's out? What would you like to see? What don't you want to see? Chapter 70. Build, build, build. Aberdeen City, several months prior. I have a surprise for you. Her husband's low velvety voice graced her ears as his warm hand wrapped around her waist, bringing her to the study table. Happy birthday, he said, and she opened her eyes to see a large piece of paper splayed out the table. She blinked and quickly approached it, seeing it for what it was. Drawings of a villa. Her beautiful green eyes widened and met his blue ones. She looked at its size, its address, and overall magnitude. She knew that this must have cost a fortune. She wrapped her arms around his neck to give him a smooch on the cheek, and he wrapped his arms around her in response. But before he could dip his head for a more intimate kiss, Althea couldn't help but want to tease him. Her lips twitched, and she pinched his cheek before he could kiss her, faking a pout. And there, I thought you handed all your paycheck to me. Ha blinked and paused before bursting to a laugh. I do give you all of my paychecks, he said, but I keep my bonuses. Then he escaped her claws on his face by grabbing them, and he dipped down his head to meet her lips, soon changing the angle of his head for more access. He tasted his wife for a while before, very reluctantly, parting with her. As he did so, he placed their foreheads together to maintain contact. Otherwise, how could I buy gifts for my beautiful wife? She giggled and gently pushed him away so she could take a look at the initial plans. Garen smiled as he wrapped his arms around her stomach, resting his chiseled chin on her soft hair. Together, they looked and studied the drawings. We'll put your laboratory here, Garen said, pointing at the plan where the best rooms at the ground floor should be. He also allocated quite a big chunk of area here. I will find the best experts in laboratory constructions, so every safety measures would be taken. She smiled, touched, and gave him another peck before resuming on studying the plans. They then planned and improved on his kitchen and gym, as well as her greenhouse and home gardens. There was also an old-school library with hardbound books. And of course, there was also the rooms of their future children, their play areas, their study rooms. It took them hours to finalize and perfect it. The couple stared at the construction plans, excited about building their own home, which would signify the next phase of their lives. However, they wouldn't be moving to this house at all, nor would it even complete its construction. Because Garen would go missing soon after, not to be heard of again. 28 days of protection period. Althea heaved a sigh as unasked for memories came to mind. She shook her head of the thoughts and resumed staring at the Lord panel and the map of the territory it showed to her. First, she built the village center, LV1, so she could have a pivot point of activity. This was basically the center of a territory, so she planned to give it enough prestige in time. Not to mention, unlike the wall, every building could only be built as LV1. This meant that eventually, she would be upgrading these buildings, and she also had to leave enough provision for expansion. As such, she allowed a huge easement of 50 meters at front and back, and 100 meters at the sides. Even if the upgrade wouldn't require so much space, she could just add parks and other facilities in these areas. She placed this setup roughly in the center of the territory. She also built about half a hectare of semi-paved space in front of the village center to serve as the public square. She then turned to the infrastructure tab and directly built a road, an avenue from the village center to the southwest gate. She planned for future development. Considering the number of Terrans that transferred and the few number of Lord tokens based on the requirements, each territory would definitely have thousands, if not tens of thousands, of people in the future. Construction, even system buildings, could no longer be moved once placed. Would they have to endure the traffic should the population grow by the thousands? She didn't want to destroy buildings just so she could give way to road widening. The main road had a 6-lane or 18 meters wide carriageway, each lane about 3 meters wide, with 3 lanes per direction. These avenues would be separated by middle islands, and 2 meters of sidewalk on each of the 2 sides. Except for the larger walkways, were there even cars here? She didn't know, but there should be carriages at least. She also followed modern design and left space every meter for some bonsai. It was worth noting that for every place she built, the trees and rocks superseded by built buildings automatically turned into resources. These were full-grown trees and boulders, which had somewhat lightened up her resource problem. Of course, as someone with a brain, she tried to retain as much greenery as she could. Returning to the actual buildings, the architectural style she set was a mixture of the rich Eastern flair and the sophisticated West. There were the intricate designs of the Eastern cultures, but there were the extra stability associated with the Western ones. Quite exciting to look at, in her opinion. It was such a good thing that she could also customize the system buildings, albeit it was limited to the facade and was more expensive. She had always believed that beauty was needed for the spiritual health, and she wanted everything in her turf to be beautiful, even if it was a bit costly. The next thing she did was build a group of houses. The distance from the center to the edge was a kilometer, and she obviously could not fill this space up. So she just built around 10 multi-purpose residential commercial buildings along each side of the main, and only, road, and added the 150 SQM house end lots on the smaller 6-meter streets behind them. The houses were varied. She set about 10 houses for a family unit for a selling price of 50 gold. If they wished to rent, because they had all 2 floors for themselves, they had to shoulder the whole 200 copper per day. Although the return for rental was 8 months, it would be very friendly to citizens. For the sake of the people, she could heroically give up some of the convenience of fast ROI for the houses. After all, 300 square meters was huge. How many people of a team could fit and share the costs? Of course, the best thing was that they still purchased it. The best profit was there, at least in the short term, and she needed a lot of money during the developmental phase of the territory. The next housing type was the duplexes, where each floor will have different families or teams. The selling price was set to 30 gold, with the rental of 100 copper per day. A floor could comfortably accommodate 10 people, so people could share the space. A person would only need to pay 10 copper a day to have a decent roof above his head, and this could be said to still be quite fair. However, she decided to set a limit that houses could only be rented by residents, temporary or permanent, while visitors could only go to inns coming soon or rent a bed space owned by the house owners. In the future, this could be an additional source of income for everyone. Finally, she set up a dorm-type building a few streets away from the main street. She took down most of the side walls and placed 5 modules together. They had shared bathrooms and kitchens. These bed spaces could be rented at a very friendly price of 1 copper per day. People could stay here indefinitely, though she thought few would because they would witness the others, possibly their roommates, moving out and improving their lives. Next, she placed the weapons store next to the square. System and other main shops would also be placed around this area. If she were to someday build important public buildings, It was estimated this would be their location as well. She watched in satisfaction as the foundation works of the buildings began. All the buildings should be completed by the end of the day. The magic of it all still amazed her to no end. As for the farm, she had to move to the area in the northeast of the river, and where the main road to the east gate would be. It was relatively flat, and even if it wasn't, it was not a problem at all. She mused if she placed the farm on the mountains, it would produce a terraced field instead. For now, she had to check her stats to see how much resources she still had. Territory stats. Area, 3,142,000 square meters. Residents, 7 permanent, 0 temporary. Total population, 7. Base resources. Wood, 125,000. Stone, 53,000. Money, 7276 gold, 91,367 silver, 15,287 copper. Reputation, 0. Buildings, Village Center LV1, Weaponry Shop LV1, Defensive Wall LV3. Bonus Building, Custom Building. Building slots, 3-5 plus 1. She still had 2 building slots left. Clearly, she only had space for a farm. Immediately, the answer dawned on her. No wonder the custom building could only be used once and was so expensive. It bought her a precious building slot.